Cold espresso always tasted like copper. Vashti swirled the murky dregs in her porcelain cup, watching the man across her mahogany desk slowly crumble. 20 years of company loyalty, cleanly erased by a single signature. Billionaires never win with grand strategies. They win by stepping over good men. Keep listening. The air purifier in the corner of the boardroom hummed, a low, sterile vibration that chewed up the silence. Vashti kept her posture rigid. Her tailored wool blazer felt like armor, heavy and suffocating across her shoulders, but she did not loosen her posture. Opposite her sat Alan. He was sweating. It wasn't a dignified sweat. A damp patch bloomed violently under the armpits of his faded blue dress shirt, and a single bead of moisture clung to the ridge of his nose. He smelled faintly of dial soap and sheer, unadulterated panic. "Vashti," Alan said, his voice cracking on the final syllable. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Ms. Hale, you can't. I spearheaded the regional distribution network. I built the Cincinnati hub from the ground up." "And you were compensated fairly for that work, Alan," Vashti replied. Her voice was flat, practiced. She didn't look at his eyes. She looked at his hands. They were trembling, the knuckles thick and slightly scarred from a weekend carpentry habit he'd mentioned once at a holiday party 5 years ago. His fingernails were bitten down to the quick. "The board is restructuring. Apex Logistics is pivoting to automated sorting. Your middle management tier is redundant. It is a mathematical certainty, not a personal vendetta." "My daughter," Alan blurted out. It was a desperate, ugly tactic, and they both knew it. He leaned forward, his chest pressing against the polished edge of the table. "Lily's asthma treatments, the premium health coverage. If you sever me now, the Cobra payments alone will bankrupt us in 2 months. Give me a demotion. Put me on the floor. I'll drive a forklift." Vashti felt a sharp, tight pinch behind her sternum. Guilt. It tasted like bile, but she swallowed it down, masking it with a slow exhale. She could not afford leaks in her hull. The shareholders were watching Q3 margins like starved hawks. If she showed mercy to Alan, she'd have to show mercy to the 300 other terminal employees on the spreadsheet sitting in her inbox. "The severance package is standard," Vashti said, sliding a thick manila envelope across the slick wood. The paper made a dry, scraping sound. 6 weeks' pay. You are finished here, Alan. Security will need your badge by noon." She stood up, ending the conversation. She didn't wait for him to gather his things. She turned her back, the click of her Louboutins echoing off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the grey sprawl of the city. She heard him stand. She heard the ragged, shallow intake of his breath. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. It wasn't a threat, it was a plea, weak and fractured. The door clicked shut. Vashti finally closed her eyes, pressing 2 manicured fingers to her temples. The faint smell of his cheap soap lingered in the sterile, ozone-filtered air of her office. She opened a window on her laptop and deleted his access credentials. Just like that, 20 years of a man's life became a 0. Down in the subterranean parking garage, the air was thick with the smell of gasoline and damp concrete. Alan fumbled with his keys, dropping them twice onto the oil-stained asphalt. His chest felt tight, bound by iron bands of anxiety. He unlocked his 2012 Honda Civic. The driver's side door shrieked in protest. He slumped into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel. The faux leather was peeling, leaving black flakes on his palms. He didn't cry. Crying required energy he didn't possess. Instead, he just stared at the dust motes dancing in the dim light of the parking structure. In the passenger seat sat a pink plastic inhaler and a crumpled math worksheet. Lily. She was waiting for him at the after-school program. Alan turned the ignition. The engine sputtered, caught, and idled rough. He drove out of the corporate campus, watching the pristine glass towers of Apex Logistics shrink in his rearview mirror. The severance check in his pocket felt heavy, like a stone dragging him toward the bottom of a very dark ocean. He was 42, a single father, with a resume that screamed obsolete. Vashti Hale had told him he was finished. As he navigated the stop-and-go traffic of the interstate, the harsh, glaring brake lights reflecting off his windshield, Alan believed her. 14 days later, the smell of burnt toast and lingering anxiety hung heavy in Alan's cramped apartment. He stood over the kitchen sink, scrubbing a pan with a sponge that had long lost its abrasive edge. Through the thin walls, he could hear the muffled bass of a neighbor's television and the rattling cough of his daughter in the living room. "Dad?" Lily's voice was small, raspy. Alan closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the cheap laminate counter. He dried his hands on a towel and walked out. Lily was sitting cross-legged on the faded beige carpet, clutching a colored pencil. She looked pale. "Take a puff, Bug," Alan said, trying to keep his voice steady. He handed her the plastic inhaler. She took it, pressing it to her lips and breathing in the medication. The sharp hiss filled the room. "Are you going to work today?" she asked, looking up at him with wide, observant eyes. "I have some meetings," Alan lied smoothly. It was a practiced lie now. Important stuff, checking out some new real estate. The truth was, nobody wanted a 42-year-old logistics manager whose only expertise was operating a system that AI now did in 3 seconds. He had bombed 6 interviews. The severance money was bleeding out, devoured by rent, groceries, and pharmacy bills. He left the apartment an hour later, the chilly autumn wind biting at the collar of his worn corduroy jacket. He didn't have a destination. He just needed to walk, to burn off the restless, gnawing panic in his gut. His feet carried him toward the industrial district, a graveyard of forgotten brick and rusted iron flanking the river. The air here smelled of brine, rotting riverweed, and diesel exhaust. Apex Logistics had abandoned this sector a decade ago, moving to the tax-subsidized tech parks in the suburbs. Alan paused near the chain-link fence of Pier 42. Behind the rust-eaten wire sat a massive, dilapidated warehouse. The roof was partially caved in, exposing twisted steel girders to the grey sky. Weeds choked the loading docks. A faded, peeling sign read, "Hale Maritime and Storage." Vashti's father's original holding, long discarded, deemed a toxic liability on a corporate balance sheet. Alan stared at the loading bays. His mind, conditioned by 2 decades of routing, shipping, and spatial organization, began to involuntarily map the ruin. 4 bays, deep floor space, easy access to the main arterial highway that bypassed the downtown traffic chokeholds. A heavy, jagged piece of corrugated metal flapped in the wind, groaning against its rusted bolts. Why was the local delivery sector failing? Because giants like Vashti's Apex Logistics refused to deal with the micro vendors, the artisan coffee roasters, the independent bookstores, the local hardware suppliers. They were being crushed by Apex's exorbitant short-haul fees. Apex only cared about moving thousands of tons. They didn't care about moving 50 boxes across town. A dangerous, desperate idea sparked in the back of Alan's mind. It wasn't born of heroism. It was born of sheer, terrifying survival instinct. He found the property listing on his cracked smartphone. It was scheduled for a municipal tax auction the following morning. The starting bid was practically nothing. The city just wanted someone to take on the property taxes and the asbestos liability. To buy it, Alan would need everything: his severance, his meager 401k, and something more. That evening, he sat in a dimly lit diner across from a man named Sullivan. Sullivan wasn't a bank. He was a man who wore too much cologne and loaned money at interest rates that made traditional loan sharks blush. The vinyl booth squeaked as Sullivan leaned forward, sliding a cashier's check across the sticky Formica table. "You miss a payment, Artie, and I don't send collection letters," Sullivan said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He smelled like peppermint and stale cigarette smoke. Alan stared at the check. His stomach churned, a volatile mix of nausea and adrenaline. He thought of Lily's cough. He thought of Vashti Hale's cold, unblinking stare as she handed him his walking papers. He reached out, his calloused fingers closing over the paper. "I won't miss," Alan said, though his voice lacked conviction. The next 3 months were a blur of physical agony. Alan owned the warehouse, but it was a shell. He couldn't afford contractors. He did the labor himself. Every morning, he dropped Lily at school and drove to Pier 42. He wore heavy canvas gloves that eventually wore through at the fingertips. He hauled out mounds of sodden, rotting cardboard, dead pigeons, and rusted machinery. The smell of mildew and guano was permanently etched into his nasal passages. His muscles, softened by years of desk work, screamed in protest. His lower back felt as though it were being ground into powder. There were days he sat on the cracked concrete floor, his hands bleeding from pulling up splintered floorboards, and wept. Not quiet, cinematic tears, but ugly, heaving sobs of exhaustion and regret. He had risked his daughter's future on a ruin. But slowly, the warehouse breathed again. He patched the roof with cheap tin. He bought 3 beat-up, second-hand delivery vans. He installed a rudimentary inventory software system he coded himself late at night at his kitchen table. He named it Grey Local. He didn't pitch to the big fish. He walked into local bakeries, craft breweries, and independent auto parts stores. He offered them guaranteed same-day local delivery for 40% less than Apex Logistics. He offered a firm handshake and a promise. It was messy. The vans broke down. Deliveries were late in the first few weeks. Alan barely slept, living on stale diner coffee and ibuprofen. But he was cheaper than Vashti Hale, and he was local. The orders began to trickle in. Then they began to pour. Vashti Hale did not like anomalies on her spreadsheets. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 6 months after Alan's termination. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, blurring the city skyline into a smear of grey and neon. Vashti sat at her desk, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She smelled of her signature bergamot perfume, crisp and sharp. She tapped a French manicured fingernail against the screen of her tablet. The sharp clack-clack echoed in the quiet room. "Explain this," she said, without looking up. Thomas, her VP of Regional Operations, shifted uncomfortably in the leather chair opposite her. He cleared his throat. It's the short-haul margins for the downtown sector, Vashti. We're seeing a 12% drop in Q3. I can read the numbers, Thomas. I asked for an explanation. Vashti snapped, her voice cold. 12% is not a rounding error. Did fuel costs spike in that zip code alone? Did our drivers decide to take a collective sabbatical? No, ma'am, Thomas stammered. He pulled at the collar of his shirt. It's attrition. We're losing the micro accounts, the independent vendors. Let them go, Vashti dismissed, waving a hand. They are pennies. We deal in dollars. It's not just the pennies anymore, Thomas insisted, leaning forward. This new outfit is pooling them. They're establishing a localized grid that bypasses our sorting hubs entirely. They pick up directly from the manufacturer and deliver straight to local retail. They are undercutting our freight fees by nearly half. Several of our mid-tier clients are threatening to jump ship to them. Vashti finally looked up. Her dark eyes narrowed. Who are they? A startup, Thomas said, swallowing hard. Operating out of the old Pier 42 facility. Grey local. The name hit Vashti like a physical blow. The breath hitched in her throat for a fraction of a second, an involuntary reaction she immediately suppressed. Alan Gray, the sweating, desperate man with the frayed cuffs who had begged for his job in this very room. She felt a strange, contradictory flutter in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was a bizarre mix of irritation and respect. No, she shut the thought down. It was an insult. A man she had discarded was chipping away at the foundation of her empire from a condemned warehouse she had written off as garbage. Get my car, Vashti said, standing up and grabbing her trench coat from the brass rack. Vashti, you don't need to handle this personally, Thomas protested. I can send legal. We can drown him in regulatory compliance checks. The Pier 42 building probably violates a dozen zoning codes. Get my car, Thomas, she repeated, her tone leaving no room for debate. The drive to the industrial district took 40 minutes in the heavy rain. The tires of her black town car hissed over the slick, pothole-riddled asphalt. As they approached Pier 42, Vashti stared out the tinted window. The place was still a visual nightmare. The brickwork was stained with decades of industrial soot. But the weeds were gone. The loading bays were clear, brightly lit with cheap halogen bulbs that cast a harsh, yellow glare into the gloomy afternoon. 4 delivery vans were backed into the bays, and workers in heavy rain slickers were moving pallets of goods with frantic, coordinated energy. It wasn't elegant. It was loud, dirty, and chaotic, but it was moving. Vashti ordered her driver to wait. She stepped out of the car, popping a black umbrella. The smell of wet asphalt, diesel, and river sludge assaulted her senses, a sharp contrast to the filtered air of her executive suite. She walked up the concrete ramp, her heels clicking aggressively. A burly man with a clipboard tried to stop her, but she ignored him, pushing past the heavy plastic flaps of the warehouse entrance. Inside, the noise was deafening. The roar of a forklift engine, the shout of workers, the chaotic symphony of commerce. And there, in the center of it all, was Alan. He didn't look like the man who had sat in her office. He was wearing a grease-stained canvas jacket and faded jeans. He was thinner, his cheekbones sharp, dark circles carved deep beneath his eyes. He held a clipboard in one hand and a radio in the other, barking an order to a forklift driver over the din. His hands were wrapped in athletic tape, filthy and calloused. He turned, sensing her presence. When Alan saw Vashti standing there, immaculate in her tailored coat, holding a perfectly dry umbrella. He didn't flinch. 6 months ago, her gaze would have made him sweat. Now, he just looked tired and dangerously focused. Vashti walked toward him, stepping over a puddle of murky water. "You're trespassing, Vashti," Alan said, over the noise of the warehouse. His voice was rough, like he'd been shouting all day. "You bought my father's garbage dump," Vashti replied, stopping a few feet away. She looked around, her nose wrinkling slightly at the smell of damp cardboard and oil. "I'm surprised the roof hasn't collapsed on you. Tin patches hold up better than you'd think," Alan said, tossing his clipboard onto a nearby crate. He didn't look intimidated. He looked annoyed. "What do you want? I have 4 routes dispatching in 10 minutes, and unlike Apex, my drivers don't have time to idle." Vashti studied him. She noticed the slight tremor in his hand. Not from fear, she realized, but from physical exhaustion. The man was running on fumes. "You're disrupting my local market," Vashti stated plainly. "You're pricing your runs below sustainability. You're bleeding cash, Alan. I know how the math works. You take predatory loans to cover the overhead, and you try to drown me in volume. It's a suicide mission." Alan let out a short, hollow laugh. He stepped closer to her. The smell of cheap coffee and raw, honest sweat wafted off him. "You think this is a strategy?" Alan asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You think I'm playing a game of chess with you? You took my livelihood, Vashti. You took my daughter's health care. I didn't build this to beat you. I built this because if I didn't, we were going to starve." He pointed a taped, bruised finger at the floor. "This isn't a board game. It's a life raft. And if my life raft happens to bump into your luxury yacht and scratch the paint, that's your problem, not mine." Vashti felt a muscle feather in her jaw. She was accustomed to men who spoke in corporate jargon, men who calculated risks in comfortable chairs. She was not accustomed to raw, unadulterated survival. It was chaotic. It was unpredictable. "Your life raft is built on a high-interest loan from a man named Sullivan," Vashti said smoothly, playing the one card she had pulled from her background check. She watched Alan's eyes widen a fraction of an inch. A direct hit. "Sullivan doesn't care about your daughter's asthma, Alan. When you miss your quarterly balloon payment, he'll take this warehouse and he'll break your legs. Sell to me. Now, I'll absorb Grey Local, pay off your debt, and give you a lump sum. You can walk away." Alan stared at her. For a moment, the heavy silence between them was louder than the roaring forklift. He looked at the rain lashing against the thin tin roof he had patched with his own bleeding hands. He thought of the terrifying, suffocating weight of Sullivan's debt hovering over him. It would be so easy to say yes, to take the buyout, to sleep for a week. Then he looked back at Vashti, at her pristine clothes, her perfect composure, the absolute lack of dust on her shoes. "No," Alan said. The word tasted like iron in his mouth. Vashti's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" I said no. Alan turned away, picking up his clipboard. He keyed his radio. "Bay 4, you're cleared for dispatch. Get moving." He looked over his shoulder at the billionaire CEO, standing in his grime. "Get out of my warehouse, Vashti. You're in the way." Vashti Hale stood frozen for 3 seconds. Nobody spoke to her like that. Nobody. She turned on her heel and walked out into the rain, her mind racing. Alan Gray wasn't just a discarded employee anymore. He was a variable she hadn't controlled. And as she slid into the back of her town car, Brushing a single drop of dirty rainwater off her lapel, she realized something terrifying. She was looking forward to crushing him. Numbers rarely lied, but lately they mocked Vashti. She sat in the pale glow of her monitors, watching the downtown sector metrics bleed a steady, obnoxious red. For 3 weeks, she had weaponized Apex Logistics' massive capital reserves against Grey Local. She slashed short-haul freight prices by 60%, deliberately operating at a loss in Allen's only territory. It was a classic siege tactic. Starve the enemy out. It should have taken 10 days. It had been 21. Vashti pinched the bridge of her nose. The faint scent of her bergamot perfume was entirely drowned out by the harsh, metallic tang of ozone coming from the office air purifiers. She wasn't sleeping. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the grime under Allen's fingernails, the aggressive, desperate tilt of his chin. He had refused her money. He had refused her mercy. She tapped her intercom. "Thomas, double the discount in the downtown grid. Make our local deliveries practically free." "Vashti, the board will notice." Thomas's voice crackled, laced with hesitation. "We're burning hundreds of thousands of dollars just to spite a guy working out of a condemned shed." "Do it, Thomas." She cut the connection. Her chest felt tight. It wasn't just business anymore. It was an ideological war. If Allen could survive on grit and a rusted warehouse, it meant the entire sterilized, automated empire she had built was inherently fragile. Across town, the squeeze was crushing Allen into dust. He leaned against the cold, corrugated metal of Bay 2, a half-empty mug of lukewarm diner coffee trembling in his hand. The warehouse was too quiet. 2 of his 4 vans were parked, their engines ticking as they cooled. No routes. The local bakeries and auto shops had been apologetic, but nobody could refuse Apex's new rates. Free was free. Allen's boots felt like they were filled with wet cement. His lower back screamed a dull, constant warning. He closed his eyes, inhaling the damp, mildewed air of the facility. It smelled like failure. A sharp, rhythmic scraping sound broke the silence. Allen opened his eyes. Sullivan was walking up the concrete ramp. The loan shark wore a cheap leather jacket that squeaked with every step, and the overpowering stench of peppermint and stale tobacco hit Allen before the man even spoke. 2 heavily built men flanked him, their eyes scanning the empty loading bays with predatory boredom. "Artie," Sullivan rasped, stopping a few feet away. He didn't smile. He reached out and tapped the hood of one of the parked vans. The hollow thump echoed terribly in the cavernous space. "Looks quiet today. Quiet isn't profitable." "The balloon payment isn't due for another 12 days, Sullivan," Allen said. He forced his voice to stay level, burying his hands in his jacket pockets to hide the shaking. 12 days is a long time in this economy, Sullivan mused, pulling a roll of mints from his pocket. He popped one into his mouth, chewing it with a wet, crunching sound. "I hear Apex is giving away the farm. I hear your little clients are jumping ship. A man in my position, Artie, he starts to worry about his investments when he hears things like that. I have it under control. The holiday rush starts next week. We'll make the quota." Sullivan stepped closer. He invaded Allen's personal space, the smell of smoke suffocating him. He placed a heavy, ringed hand on Allen's shoulder, squeezing just hard enough to dig into the muscle. "You better, Artie, because if I have to come back here on the 13th day, I'm not taking the vans. I'm taking the building." and I'll consider the balance settled out of your hide." Sullivan patted his cheek, a demeaning, casual slap, and turned away. The three men walked back into the grey afternoon. Alan stood frozen until their taillights disappeared down the cracked access road. Then he staggered back, his knees giving out, and slid down the cold metal of the loading bay door until he hit the concrete floor. He buried his face in his calloused hands. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was the school nurse. "Mr. Gray, it's Lily. Her breathing is shallow again. We need you to come get her." Alan swallowed a sob. It tasted like ash. He pushed himself off the floor, his muscles burning. He was a man running on fumes, and the tank had just run dry. Autumn snapped into winter with brutal indifference. A freak ice storm hit the city on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, coating the power lines and asphalt in an inch of solid, treacherous glass. In the Apex Logistics Tower, the silence was absolute and terrifying. Vashti stood in the center of the control room. The massive digital map of the regional transit grid, usually a pulsing network of green lines, was entirely red. Sirens weren't blaring. The crisis was digital, silent, and catastrophic. "Talk to me," Vashti demanded, her voice cutting through the hushed panic of a dozen technicians. Thomas looked up from his console, his face pale, shining with cold sweat. The automated routing software pushed a mandatory update at midnight. It clashed with the GPS weather rerouting protocols. The algorithm is caught in a loop. It's freezing the entire fleet. Override it. Put the drivers on manual. "We can't," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "The trucks are digitally governed by the central hub. The system thinks the roads are impassable, so it's locked the ignitions to prevent liability. The entire regional fleet is dead in the water. We have 300 tons of perishables, medical supplies, and holiday freight sitting in locked trucks across the city." Vashti stared at the red map. Her stomach plummeted. Her perfect billion-dollar machine had just been defeated by a line of bad code and freezing rain. The hospitals were waiting on localized pharmaceutical drops. The independent grocers were waiting on perishable holiday stock. "How long to patch?" she asked, gripping the edge of the console. 12 hours, maybe 14. They would lose millions. But worse, they would lose trust. The illusion of Apex's invincibility was shattering. Across town, Pier 42 was a beacon of ugly, analog resilience. Alan didn't have algorithms. He had CB radios, tire chains, and a desperate need to stay alive. The warehouse was freezing, your breath pluming in the air, but it was electric with activity. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. The businesses that had abandoned him for Apex's free deliveries were calling back in a panic. Apex trucks weren't moving. Could Grey Local do it? Yes, Alan barked into his headset, grabbing a clipboard. Yes, we can. Have the pallets ready. He was running a fever. He had slept 3 hours in the last 2 days. Every joint in his body felt like it was packed with shattered glass. But he moved. He strapped chains onto the bald tires of his delivery vans. He hired local kids with pickup trucks, paying them cash out of his own meager pocket to run the smaller routes. He drew maps on a massive whiteboard, bypassing the iced-over highways and routing his drivers through the gritted back streets. At 3 p.m., a black town car, its tires wrapped in thick snow chains, crunched into the icy lot of Pier 42. Vashti stepped out into the freezing slush. She wore a heavy cashmere coat, but the biting wind cut right through it. She walked into the warehouse. The halogen lights flickered, fighting the groaning power grid. The smell of exhaust and cheap heating oil filled her lungs. She found Alan near the loading docks. He was physically lifting a crate of pharmaceutical supplies into the back of a rusted Ford pickup, his breath coming in ragged, wheezing gasps. He looked terrible. His face was grey, his eyes bloodshot, his jacket stained with grease and road salt. He dropped the crate, swaying slightly on his feet, and turned to see her. He didn't have the energy to be angry. He just leaned against the tailgate, wiping a streak of dirty sweat from his forehead. "You lost, Vashti?" he asked, his voice barely a rasp. Vashti looked at him. She looked at the whiteboard covered in frantic, hand-drawn routes. She looked at the teenage drivers loading their own trucks, fueled by nothing but Alan's sheer force of will. Apex was paralyzed by a frozen server. Grey Local was moving because a man refused to let it die. The cold realization hit her, stripping away months of corporate ego. She didn't want to crush him. She needed him. "My grid is down," Vashti said. The admission physically hurt. It felt like tearing a bandage off raw skin. "My automated fleet is locked. I have 4 pallets of emergency asthma medication sitting in a frozen hub 3 miles from here, supposed to go to the pediatric ward at St. Jude's. I can't move them." Alan stared at her. The silence stretched, filled only by the howling wind outside the tin roof. He looked down at his taped hands. He thought of Lily, sitting in the office with her inhaler. "Give me the manifest," Alan said quietly. "Alan." "I said give me the manifest, Vashti. Where is the hub?" He didn't gloat. He didn't negotiate. He just turned back to his radio, calling one of his drivers back to the bay. It took 3 hours. Alan drove one of the vans himself, navigating the treacherous, ice-slicked hills to the Apex hub, cutting the digital padlocks off the stalled trucks with bolt cutters and loading the medical supplies by hand. Vashti rode in the passenger seat. She didn't speak. She just watched him. She watched his jaw clench in pain every time he shifted gears. She watched the raw, unfiltered humanity that her algorithms could never replicate. By the time they returned to Pier 42, it was dark. The power had flickered out, and the warehouse was lit by the headlights of the vans and a few battery-powered lanterns. Alan killed the engine of the van and slumped over the steering wheel. He didn't move. He just lay there, his breathing shallow and rapid. Vashti got out and opened his door. "Alan." He slowly lifted his head. "Deliveries are done," he mumbled. "Tell Sullivan. Tell him I have the money." "Alan, Sullivan isn't coming," Vashti said softly. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a thick document, illuminated by the harsh glow of the headlights. "I bought your debt this morning. Before the storm. I bought the paper from him." Alan's eyes tried to focus on her. "Why? So you could break my legs instead?" "No." Vashti felt a strange tightness in her throat. She looked around the freezing, dirty warehouse. It was the ugliest place she had ever been, and the most magnificent. "Because my empire is a machine, Alan. It's perfect, and it's sterile, and when the code breaks, the machine dies. You aren't a machine." She held the document out to him. "This isn't a hostile takeover. It's a merger. I need a localized, human-driven grid. I need a fail-safe. I need a partner who knows how to survive when the power goes out. You keep Pier 42. You keep Grey Local. Apex provides the capital and the long-haul freight. We integrate." Alan stared at the paper. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't take it. The exhaustion was finally pulling him under. "The debt?" he whispered. "Erased," Vashti said. She stepped closer, ignoring the grime that brushed against her cashmere coat. "You won, Alan. The warehouse is yours. The network is yours." He let out a long, shuddering breath. The fight drained out of him all at once. He didn't cheer. He didn't celebrate. He just leaned his head back against the cheap fabric of the van seat and closed his eyes. "I have to go pick up Lily," he said softly. Vashti nodded, stepping back into the freezing air. "Go. Take tomorrow off, partner. The machines can handle the rest." She watched him slowly climb out of the van, a broken man who had just bent a billionaire's empire to his will. The scent of ozone and corporate perfection was gone from her mind, replaced entirely by the smell of exhaust, cold rain, and victory. If you love this story about resilience, corporate rivalry, and fighting for family, hit that like button right now. It really helps support the channel. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that sheer human grit can beat the odds. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our deep, emotional audio dramas. Drop a comment below. Would you have accepted Vashti's deal? See you in the next one.